When interstellar object 3I Atlas unexpectedly flashes white above Earth and begins transmitting a signal no instrument can fully decode, a lone radio astronomer becomes the accidental first recipient of a message humanity was never prepared to hear. As global agencies scramble, the signal evolves, changing its rhythm, its structure, and finally, its target, forcing the narrator into a spiraling confrontation with the possibility that the message isn't just communication, but an intervention. By the time the world realizes what the signal actually wants, it's already too late to undo the consequences. They told us the recording was corrupted, that the flash was just an artifact, that nothing meaningful came from the sky that night. But I've heard the raw file, the one that was never supposed to leave the server room. And once you hear it too, you won't look at a quiet night sky the same way again. If you stay with me until the end of this story, you'll never again believe that the universe is ignoring us. And you might find yourself listening for something that, honestly, I wish I could unhear.
On paper, the night it began was routine, boring in exactly the way astronomers secretly love. Clear sky, steady instruments, no urgent emails from mission control. Just me, a monitor full of flat lines, and an interstellar rock we thought we already understood. My name is Daniel Ward, senior radio astronomer at the Deep Sky Array in New Mexico, and I was one of the first people on Earth to realize that 3I Atlas was trying to talk. Officially, 3I Atlas was a solved mystery by then. It had been cataloged months earlier as the third confirmed interstellar object, an icy fragment screaming through our solar system on a one-way trajectory, a visitor with no intention of staying. People had already done the press conferences, the glossy visualizations with the glowing orbit lines around the sun, the breathless explainers about how unlikely it was that we even saw it. Then the news cycle moved on. Two interstellar objects before it, 1I Oumuamua and 2I Borisov, had already trained us to shrug and say, yes, space throws rocks at us from other stars sometimes, that doesn't mean anything. 3I was supposed to be more of the same. Our job at the array was simple. Keep an eye on it, log its radio silence, publish a paper one day proving, once and for all, that the universe was not secretly broadcasting from every stray chunk of ice drifting between the stars. You can see the irony from here. I remember the time because I checked my watch 3 times in the minute before everything went wrong. It was 02:14 local, a Tuesday bleeding into a Wednesday, the kind of dead hour where the human brain falls into a soft fog, and the hum of the equipment becomes a lullaby. The consoles glowed a soft blue, the air conditioning whispered, and outside the glass, the dishes of the array turned with that slow, lazy dignity that makes machines feel almost alive. The feed from the Optical Observatory in Chile, one of our partner facilities, showed 3I Atlas as a faint reddish smear against black, nothing to distinguish it from the thousands of other smudges drifting through the field. I leaned back, sipped coffee gone cold 2 hours earlier, and scrolled through the automated logs. Non-gravitational accelerations, unusual polarization, all the weirdnesses that had already made 3I a darling of the theorists. None of that was my problem. My job was to confirm the simplest thing imaginable, that it wasn't transmitting. At 02:15, the sky went white. Not daylight white, not lightning white. A kind of clinical, clean white that washed across every optical sensor pointed anywhere near 3I's projected position. The feed from Chile saturated in 2 frames, the comet smear blooming into a featureless patch of brilliance before the protective software slammed the exposure down. In the control room, the optical tech on duty swore, then laughed, then swore again, assuming a glitch. At the array, the light didn't hit my eyes until a fraction of a second later as the Chilean data relayed through the network, but something else hit us at the same instant, something my eyes never saw, but my instruments did. On my screen, the flat baseline on channel 42, one of the bands we had set to passively watch the region around 3I, jumped straight up like a heart monitor detecting its first pulse. The line overshot its range, clipped hard against the top of the graph, and for a full second, the console just froze there, a solid block of saturated color, before the system caught up and began redrawing at a higher scale. I stared at it, not understanding at first. Radio frequency interference happens all the time. Satellites, ground radar, some idiot's Wi-Fi project from 3 states away bouncing off the ionosphere. But you feel those things, metaphorically. You see the telltale smear, the spread across frequencies, the messy human fingerprint. This wasn't messy. This was a spike. Clean, surgical, centered on one narrow band, with a rise time that the software politely labeled unphysical, because that's what you write when you don't want to use the word impossible. For a moment, the room stayed quiet. The array hummed. My coffee tasted as bitter as always. Then a second spike hit. This one lower, but still far above background, not a single flash, but a cluster of pulses, like someone rapping their knuckles on the door. 3 short, 1 long, then silence. It felt stupid to think of it as knocking, so I didn't. Not out loud, not yet. I did what every trained scientist does when the universe shows you something that doesn't fit. I blamed the hardware. My first instinct was to look for a local source, a misbehaving amplifier, a ghost echo from one of our calibration sources. I pulled up the diagnostic panel and watched a waterfall plot for a third spike. It arrived right on time. This one wasn't clean. It had structure, a kind of internal rhythm, subpulses stacked inside each rise and fall separated by microseconds of perfect nothing, as if someone very far away were tapping out a pattern and the void itself was keeping the beat. My mouth went dry. I didn't notice I was holding my breath until I heard the little wheeze in my own headphones as I exhaled. I patched the raw channel into audio out, something you're not supposed to do during live observation without logging it, but there was no supervisor breathing down my neck at 2 in the morning, and some part of my brain wanted to hear it, as if putting the signal into sound would make it less abstract, less alien. Static filled my ears, soft and soothing. The cosmic microwave background and electronic noise turned into a gentle hiss, and beneath it, faint but unmistakable, the third spike arrived. You can't really hear microseconds, but you can hear envelopes, the way energy rises and falls, and what came through the headphones sounded disturbingly like a digital drum beat. Abrupt ticks stacked in a way my brain immediately tried to interpret as intentional. I jerked the headphones off. For maybe 10 seconds. I did nothing. Then training kicked in. I hit record. I flagged the segment as anomalous. I opened the intercom to the second control room where Melissa, our systems engineer, was half asleep over a keyboard. "Mel, are you seeing this on 42? I asked, trying and failing to keep my voice level. She blinked at her own monitor, rubbed her eyes, and swore softly under her breath. "Could be interference," she said automatically, then frowned. "Except it's on the backup feed too, and the test harness is clean and—" Her voice trailed off. We both watched as the fourth event came in, not a spike this time, but a slow ramp. A rise over 3 seconds, a plateau, then a sudden, clipped cut to 0, the radio equivalent of someone inhaling, holding, then vanishing mid-breath. The software began screaming at us in its own way, flashing error codes, suggesting filters, offering to discard non-astrophysical artifacts for us like a helpful assistant, trying to sweep broken glass under the rug. I locked it out. That was the first decision that would later get me in trouble. The second was forwarding the raw stream to my personal archive in parallel with the official data path. It's a habit every researcher picks up when they've lived through at least one funding cycle. You don't trust that anything truly weird will survive the journey through committees and risk assessments without being quietly quarantined. Over in Chile, the optical feed recovered from its shock and began showing 3I again.
Only it didn't look like the same object. Before the flash, it had been a slightly elongated, reddish point with a faint coma, the dignified look of a quiet, dusty fragment coasting through sunlight. After the flash, the coma looked wrong, too symmetric, too smooth. The core had whitened, not the icy blue-white of water vapor, but a chalky, almost metallic white that resisted the usual color calibrations. The observers down there were swearing into their own microphones now, but their audio came through to us delayed and compressed, little bursts of accented panic that never quite lined up with what we were seeing in real time. At 02:17, 3 minutes after the first spike, the signal stopped. Not faded, not drifted, stopped. The baseline returned to its old, sleepy flatness. The static in my headphones went back to being just noise. If you were skimming the logs later, if you trusted the summary plots, you might tell yourself it had been a glitch, a hiccup, something to be explained away with a footnote in a technical appendix one day. Then all 4 spikes reappeared at once, stacked, repeated, like someone hitting rewind and play on a tape. The system started looping them, not because anything physical in the sky was repeating, but because the data buffer was shunting the same 4 events through 3 separate processing chains, each delayed by a different number of milliseconds. The result on my screen looked like a chorus of ghosts, all shouting the same word, just out of sync. Melissa killed the buffer feed with a muttered curse, then turned to me with a look I hadn't seen on her face in the 5 years we'd worked together. "This isn't local," she said. "I've killed everything that can be killed on our side. It's in the sky." She sounded like she wanted me to tell her she was wrong. I couldn't. The cross-checks were brutal and fast. The array has redundancy for a reason. We pinged 2 other radio facilities, one in Australia, one in South Africa, both with different hardware, different backends, different software stacks. Both confirmed seeing the same spikes at the same times, adjusted for light travel delay. Whatever it wasn't a piece of misbehaving equipment in New Mexico. It wasn't a prank or a satellite or a weather balloon with a radio collar. It was a transient, originating from the same patch of sky as 3I-ATLS. The unspoken word hung in the control room air like ozone after a lightning strike. Signal. We didn't say it, not out loud. Saying it would have made it real, and scientists are, above all else, allergic to making things real too quickly. On my screen, the last of the 4 events faded into the noise. I started replaying them, this time not as audio, but as numbers, amplitudes, timings, Fourier transforms. Hunting for periodicities is practically a reflex. The first spike was a single impulse, a delta function in the data. The second, 3 short, 1 long. The third, that complex, microstructured cluster. The fourth, the ramp and cut. On the waterfall plot, they lined up vertically like a word written in an alphabet we didn't know how to read. A word repeated exactly once. Then silence. These are the moments where the story, if it belonged to someone else, might take a softer turn. You'd expect cautious excitement, controlled statements, a measured release to the broader scientific community, an orderly process of verification. That's not what happened. At 02:26, 12 minutes after the first spike, my terminal popped up a login request I'd never seen before. A secure session from an internal address I didn't recognize. Melissa's console flashed the same. She raised an eyebrow, clicked accept before I could say anything, and a new window opened. Black background, white text, no logo, no polite greeting. Only a single instruction. Route live channel 42 feed to node Argos immediately. Below it, a timer counting down from 60 seconds. I felt my chest tighten. Argos was a name I'd heard only in rumors, a sort of catch-all whisper for the classified pipeline, the one that bypassed all the usual academic networks and went straight into whatever basement offices people used when they didn't want to appear in acknowledgement sections of papers. Officially, we weren't supposed to even know it existed. Unofficially, everyone did. I glanced at Melissa. She shrugged, the universal gesture for, I don't like this, but I like my job. With 2 clicks, she cloned the feed and pushed it toward the address labeled Argos. The timer vanished. Another line of text appeared. Acknowledged. Do not discuss this event on unsecured channels. Further instructions incoming. My mouth was dry again. We need to log that, I said, because the part of me that still believed in procedures was clinging to the rules like a life raft. We did log it. They logged it for us. Congratulations! We're officially not in charge of this anymore. The short relief that came with handing the problem off lasted maybe 30 seconds. That was the first wave of the emotional roller coaster, that quick sense of, good, someone else has it, someone with clearance and power and better pay. Then the second wave hit, the one where you realize that if someone you've never met cares enough to hijack your feed in under 15 minutes, whatever you just saw is not going to be a normal science story. The secure phone on the wall, the one that never rang except during emergency drills, started ringing. Melissa and I stared at it like it was a snake. Eventually, I picked it up. A man's voice, crisp and flat, no identifiable accent, spoke before I could say hello. Dr. Ward, this is Control. You will refrain from sharing any data or impressions about the event on 42 with external contacts until further notice. This includes colleagues, social media, and personal communications. Do you understand? It wasn't a question. I understand, I said anyway, because my brain had reverted to autopilot. Good. You will also forward all locally stored copies of the raw stream to the Argos node and wipe your personal archives. Confirm when complete. My eyes flicked to the corner of my screen, where the backup job I'd started a few minutes ago pulsed loyally away. Whoever this was, they either knew my habits intimately or assumed the worst of everyone. I considered lying. The impulse flared for a moment, hot and defiant. Then I remembered the timer, the urgency, the way the window had appeared before any official memo, and I thought about the kinds of people who could pull that off. I killed the backup job, pushed what I had to Argos, and told the voice it was done. Thank you, Dr. Ward, the voice said as calmly as I'd just handed over a report. One more thing. From this point forward, you are to treat 3I-ATLS as a signal source, not a passive object. Do not refer to it as a comet, asteroid, or fragment in any written communication. Internally, its designation is now Atlas Prime. That term is classified. Do you understand? Something in that wording made the hairs on my arms stand up. Yes. Understood. The line went dead. For a moment, all I could hear was the hum of the cooling fans and the distant mechanical groans of the dishes adjusting their positions. On the optical feed, Atlas Prime, 3I, whatever you wanted to call it, glowed that same unnatural white. Its tail, if you could still call it that, had narrowed into a tight, almost laser-like filament pointing slightly off from the direction of its motion, like a searchlight swept sideways. As I watched, the filament flicked, just a fraction of a degree, then settled again. It reminded me of an eye adjusting focus. Relief and fear danced together in my chest, trading places too fast to separate. Relief, because someone above my pay grade had just confirmed what my gut was already whispering, that this wasn't nothing, that I wasn't hallucinating significance. Fear, because the language was wrong, because no one would call a rock a signal source unless they had reasons they weren't sharing.
I wondered what they'd seen in those first minutes that we hadn't. For about an hour, nothing else happened. That was the brief plateau in the roller coaster, the stretch where your stomach stops lurching and you start thinking maybe the worst is over, that the drop you were bracing for won't come after all. Melissa went back to pretending to work on other projects while her eyes flicked to Channel 42 every 30 seconds. I wrote a fake progress note about calibrations, that kind of bureaucratic noise that would satisfy any casual audit without revealing the storm underneath.
The array tracked Atlas Prime as it climbed slowly away from the sun, its trajectory unchanged, its optical brightness decaying in a way that looked almost normal if you ignored the color. The radio band was quiet. No more spikes, no more knocks. The silence itself became oppressive, like the pause between questions in an interrogation. At 0339, the silence broke. The baseline wavered, shifted, then rose not in a spike this time, but in a smooth, sinusoidal swell that rolled across the band like a tide. The amplitude climbed steadily for 5 seconds to a level that made the receivers complain, then dropped back down, overshot, oscillated, and finally damped into a new, slightly higher baseline. Above the noise, clear as a heartbeat, a tone emerged. A narrow, almost pure carrier frequency sitting like a needle in the spectrum. It was stable to more decimal places than any natural source had any right to be. I didn't even have to say it. Melissa whispered it for both of us. That's artificial. The word hung there, irreversible. Artificial. I should have hit record. I should have opened a wider band, pulled in more context, done 100 things the textbooks would tell you to do. Instead, for 3 long seconds, I just listened. The tone didn't modulate. It didn't carry data in the obvious way. No simple frequency shift keying, no amplitude modulation, just sheer, stubborn, unwavering presence, like a lighthouse beam shining steadily across black water. The phone rang again before I could move. The phone's shrill ring cut through the steady carrier tone like a blade, and for a moment I hesitated, staring at the handset as if answering it would make everything real in a way I wasn't ready for. But the tone on Channel 42 held, unmoving, unnatural, unwavering, and that steadiness forced my hand. When I picked up, the same flat voice from before spoke without introduction, without breath, as though the words had been waiting behind the line long before I touched it. Dr. Ward, we have confirmation that the signal is coherent. Maintain lock on Atlas Prime, do not change gain settings, and prepare for phase variation. And just as I was about to ask what phase variation meant, the signal did it for him. The pure tone flickered as though someone pinched the frequency and released it, not drifting, not Doppler shifting, but stepping. Clean, quantized, surgical. 5 microhertz up, 5 microhertz down, then stabilizing again at the original value. A move so deliberate my scalp prickled. Melissa whispered, "Jesus," and I realized my own hands were trembling on the console, because natural intuitions wander like drunk animals, but nothing in nature steps like that unless some intelligence is forcing the pattern to stay sharp. The man on the phone continued, his voice as calm as if he were reciting a grocery list. "This variation is expected. Maintain your feed. We advise you not to draw conclusions." But the warning was pointless, because the conclusion was already drawing itself, pouring into the room like cold water. This thing wasn't just broadcasting, it was adjusting to us, compensating, synchronizing. And when the next step came, it wasn't 5 microhertz, it was 10, then 20, then a sharp snap back to baseline, like someone cracking a knuckle directly into the receiver. That was when the first wave of nausea hit me. Not from fear, but from recognition. Because I had seen that same frequency stepping once before in a lab simulation of handshake protocols between mismatched digital clocks, when 2 machines try to align their time bases by scanning for the common beat. And the thought that something out near the orbit of Mars might be performing the cosmic equivalent of "Are you there?" made my breath hitch. The voice on the phone was saying something else, but I wasn't listening, because the amplitude on the tone was rising, just a hair, just enough to register as deliberate, as though Atlas Prime were leaning closer. Then the phone barked, "Dr. Ward, acknowledge."
But before I could answer, the tone cut out completely, and the bass line fell so flat it looked dead. And in that razor-thin slice of silence, I felt every nerve in my body brace for whatever was coming next. When it came, it wasn't a tone, not at first, but a rhythmic tremor at the floor of the band, a choppiness almost lost in the noise, except it wasn't noise, it was structure. Little packets of energy flicking on and off with machine precision, and I leaned so close to the monitor I could see the pixel edges. Melissa didn't speak, didn't breathe, just stabbed the zoom controls until the tremor resolved into a ladder-like pattern, evenly spaced rungs, each one brighter than the last. A staircase rising out of the static until the top rung snapped into a new, broader band that popped out across the spectrum like a flare. It was a sweep this time. Not a tone, not a tremor, but a sweep. A rising chirp that cut across 15 kilohertz of band space in 2 seconds and ended on a frequency so clean it felt surgical. I knew that sweep too. Every radio astronomer does. The classic signature of a system mapping impedance, testing the medium, the way a radar pings an environment to learn its texture. The sweep repeated, slightly slower, and I heard myself whisper, "It's calibrating us," before I could stop the words. On the phone, the man's voice spiked, still calm but with a needle of urgency under the surface. "Dr. Ward, mute your microphone. Do not speak within range of any active recording system. We are routing your feed to containment analysis now." And that phrase, containment analysis, was what finally broke Melissa. She spun her chair toward me, eyes wide, and hissed, "Containment of what? It's light minutes away." But before either of us could spiral further, the sweep stopped, and the pure tone returned. But now it wasn't alone. Another tone appeared 30 hertz above it, then another 40 hertz below it, then two more splitting off like branches on a growing tree, creating a harmonic scaffold no natural source would ever produce. Harmonics drift, they wobble, they smear like fingerprints on glass, but these stayed locked, perfect ratios, perfect alignment, and in the spaces between them, thin threads of sidebands began to shimmer like strands of silk catching early morning light. The voice on the phone said, "All stations are reporting identical structures. Do not attempt local decoding." But my eyes had already noticed something my brain refused to accept. The spacing between the harmonics was narrowing, tiny adjustments cascading down the structure like a fractal collapsing inward towards a single point. And when that point arrived, it came as a punch. Everything snapped into one frequency, one impossible color of sound, and then the antennas outside screamed. Not audibly, their servos groaned as every dish in the array turned at once, violently, snapping toward the origin point as though dragged by invisible hooks, and the whole building shook as if in an earthquake. Melissa grabbed the desk, I grabbed the chair. Alarms exploded through the control room, red strobes flickering against the glass while mechanical locks engaged on their own, pinning some dishes in place as software desperately tried to stop the unscheduled slew. The phone dropped from my hand and clattered to the floor, the voice still speaking calmly into nothing. Even at that moment, the scientist in me knew what was happening. The signal had overloaded the pointing correction logic, tricking the antennas into thinking the source was shifting, pulling their aim like a magnet. But knowing didn't help. When the room steadied, the monitors showed the new pointing vector, and my blood ran cold.
Atlas Prime hadn't moved, but the pointing solution had. The signal was no longer coming from the coordinates of the interstellar object. It was coming from a point approximately 40 kilometers off the Earth's surface, directly above the Pacific, as if whatever was out there had reached down and placed a ghost of itself in orbit. "That's impossible," Melissa breathed, but impossible had lost all meaning 10 minutes ago. Before we could process it, the carrier jumped again, up in amplitude, up in clarity, so strong now that the receivers auto-attenuated, and the sidebands, the fractal shimmer, resolved into something that didn't look random at all. One section formed repeating peaks, evenly spaced. Another section folded onto itself in a rising and falling arc. Another built tiny modulation clusters, like syllables being punched into existence. Speech, my brain thought before I could stop it. This is speech, but not in any sense humans understand. I reached for the spectrogram controls, trying to stretch the pattern, to slow it, to trick my eyes into seeing something familiar. But then the entire structure froze. Mid-pattern, mid-pulse, locked solid as a sculpture. And in that instant, a new window opened on every console simultaneously. Black background, white text. Not from our system, not from Argos, not from anything registered on the network. Just a single message blinking as though typed by an unseen hand. Hold. The carrier tone shifted down 5 hertz. The message updated. Listen. Melissa grabbed my wrist hard enough to hurt and whispered, "Dan, it's talking to us." But the truth was worse, because it wasn't just talking, it was commanding, shaping its sidebands to force our instruments into specific interpretations, telling us to stay still, to stop scrambling, to hear what came next. Then the tone split again, forming 2 perfect frequencies that beat against each other, creating a low, throbbing interference rhythm that I felt more than I heard. A rhythm that crawled under my skin, into my chest, into my heartbeat, until I couldn't tell which pulse was mine and which belonged to the signal. The lights in the control room dimmed, surged, then held at half brightness as the power systems compensated for sudden draw, our equipment struggling to manage the precision demand the signal was forcing onto it. And when the beat stopped, the silence hit like a vacuum. In that unnatural quiet, the message on the screens changed again. Response pending. And I realized, with a coldness that rooted my feet to the floor, that Atlas Prime wasn't broadcasting anymore. It was waiting. The moment the signal began waiting was somehow worse than all the noise that came before it, because silence is easy to ignore when it's empty. But this silence wasn't empty. It had weight, like a held breath pressed against the inside of your skull. And Melissa and I stood frozen in the half-lit control room, listening to nothing and feeling as if something on the other end of that nothing was listening back. The message on every screen, response pending, blinked with the slow patience of something that didn't measure time the way we did. And for a long moment neither of us spoke, because the first person to break the silence would be the first to admit that this wasn't a glitch or interference or some freak plasma interaction. It was a conversation, or the beginning of one. And when the secure phone finally stopped its endless buzzing and died into static, I realized we were cut loose from whatever chain of command had been pretending to control this. The array hummed, the dishes outside pivoted again, but slower now, aligning with a precision so fine I knew our systems weren't dictating the motion anymore. The signal was, nudging the servos with microscopic pulses, guiding them as effortlessly as you might guide someone's hand across a page. And when the receiver logs updated, a new coordinate appeared. Not pointing at Atlas Prime anymore, but at the precise geostationary vector above the Pacific where the ghost copy of the signal had bloomed. Humans don't multitask well when the world doesn't make sense. And in that moment, my brain fractured into survival instinct, scientific curiosity, and a third feeling I had no name for, a kind of awe that felt almost like grief. And out of those 3, the survival part won first, pushing my hands forward to the console to pull up the emergency spectrum filters, to widen the band, to see if the signal was hiding something in the frequencies we weren't monitoring. But when I touched the controls, the system locked, hard, a red block flashing, access overridden by remote process, and the cursor moved on its own, as if guided by an invisible operator, sweeping across the interface and opening panels I hadn't touched since graduate school. Comb filters, deconvolution matrices, cross-correlation tools, all aligning into a processing chain I didn't recognize, one not built by humans. Melissa's nails dug into my arm as she whispered, "Dan, step away from it." But the command wasn't meant for me, and she knew it, because the cursor wasn't responding to us. It was responding to the signal. It began feeding the raw carrier into the chain, splitting it into real and imaginary components, performing transforms I'd never seen, folding the frequency domain back onto itself like origami, creating a structure out of harmonics that looked eerily like a map, or a fingerprint, or both. The speakers, which shouldn't have been active, clicked on with a soft electrical pop, and a tone rolled through the room, not the carrier anymore, but something lower,
warmer, a kind of pulsing hum that settled into my chest cavity like a second heartbeat. I couldn't tell if the sound was meant to soothe or to synchronize, but Melissa staggered back a step, clutching her sternum, and for a moment I thought she was going to faint. I grabbed her shoulder, grounding myself as much as her, and that's when the main display flickered, once, twice, then resolved into something that made my mouth go dry. A waveform that shouldn't exist unless you're looking at modulation from a source trying to encode intent, not just energy. Inside the waveform, nested like a whisper inside a shout, was a repeating signature, a gentle rise, a dip, a curl, always in the same shape, always at the same spacing, always in pairs. I knew that shape. I'd seen it endless times in human communication protocols, in handshake sequences where one machine identifies itself before negotiating data flow. And the thought came unbidden, brutal.
It's identifying itself. But self-identification assumes a listener capable of comprehension, which raised the next thought even faster. It thinks we can answer. A tiny spark of hope lit the room for half a second. Hope that maybe, impossibly, Atlas Prime had been trying to talk for longer than we realized, and we were finally on the same page. But hope died quickly when the message changed again, the text on the screens dissolving and reforming into a sentence that made my stomach twist. "You are late." Melissa stared, whispering, "Late for what?" But another message appeared before either of us could think. "Initiating redundant channel." The carrier dipped, and a second frequency opened below the first, modulating in patterns we didn't understand. Higher-order encoding, multi-layered structure, too dense, too fast. And the processing chain the signal had built began convulsing with incoming data, filling buffer after buffer until the system beeped a warning that storage was hitting critical. Then the lights flickered again, and a third frequency opened, then a fourth. Then a cluster of sidebands that crept upward like frost spreading across glass. We couldn't decode any of it. Our tools weren't even in the right universe to try, and the helplessness hit me in a wave, hot and nauseating. The man on the other end of the secure phone, whoever he was, would later accuse me of failing to maintain protocol, but standing there in the half-dark, drowned in alien data, protocol felt like a joke humans told each other to feel in control of things they never were. Melissa broke first, grabbing the emergency kill switch under the desk and slamming it down. But nothing happened. The screen stayed bright, the antennas stayed locked, the processing chain kept running, the hum in our chests kept pulsing. And she slammed it again and again until her palm went red, but the array didn't even acknowledge the attempt. The tone shifted sharply, like a reprimand, and the message updated on every screen. "Do not interrupt." I whispered, "This is insane." But part of me realized it wasn't insanity, it was hierarchy. Something with more power than us had simply taken command of our tools, our systems, our night. Then the signal quieted, everything holding perfectly still, frozen mid-analysis. And for a moment I thought maybe we had reached the end of whatever it intended to send, until a new coordinate flashed on the display, a set of numbers so precise, so local, my breath stuttered. The coordinate pointed not to Atlas Prime, not to the echo above the Pacific, not even to space. It pointed to the array itself, down to within 2 meters of where I was standing. The message updated. "Verify presence." And only then did I understand the signal wasn't waiting for Earth, it was waiting for me. I stepped back without meaning to, bumping into the console, making the speakers crackle, and the lights above flickered in response, as if the building itself had a nervous system now. Melissa grabbed my sleeve and whispered, "Dan, don't move." But the message changed again, "Respond," and it felt less like a request than a demand. My throat went dry, my mind racing through everything I knew about modulation, about input, about how something in space might expect us to reply. But we had no uplink protocol, no encoding scheme, nothing that could possibly match whatever intelligence had crafted the structures on our screens. All we had was noise, human noise, primitive and clumsy. Unless that was the point. I reached toward the console, finger trembling above the manual transmitter override, ready to do something reckless, something stupid, something that felt like the only possible choice left. And just as my fingertip brushed the switch,
Every screen in the room flashed white, the speakers spat static like tearing cloth, and a single new message appeared in stark, unblinking text. Too slow.
The words, "too slow," hung on the screens like a judgment, cold and final. And for a moment, neither Melissa nor I could move, as if any motion might trigger whatever came next. But then the lights snapped back to full power, harsh and sterile, and the carrier tone vanished entirely, leaving the room in a silence so dense it felt bruised, the kind of silence that comes after a scream. The consoles rebooted themselves one by one in a cascading ripple of flickers, and for a heartbeat, everything looked almost normal, almost safe, until the central display returned not to our monitoring interface, but to a live video feed of the array's exterior, captured from one of the maintenance cameras mounted on the western ridge. And at first, I didn't understand what I was seeing, because the dishes were still pointed skyward, motionless now, no longer under the signal's control, but the air above them shimmered like heat off asphalt, despite the fact that it was night, cold desert night, and the shimmer grew, intensifying into a column of distortion that rose like a ghostly geyser straight into the dark. Melissa whispered my name, but I couldn't answer because the distortion began folding inward, collapsing like a collapsing lung. And at the top of the frame, a pinpoint of white light appeared, not the metallic white of Atlas Prime, but a softer, almost biological white, pulsing gently, and it descended slowly, impossibly slowly, as though gravity had to negotiate with it before it agreed to fall. Alarms began triggering throughout the building, not coordinated, not synchronized, but staggered, like panicked breaths. Seismic alert, power irregularity, unauthorized uplink handshake detected. And the camera feed zoomed automagically, even though maintenance cameras aren't capable of zoom, yet the image tightened as if pulled by an unseen operator until the white point filled the frame, swollen and bright. And then it resolved, not into a solid object, not into anything with mass, but into a shape made of light. A spoked ring, thin filaments connecting its circumference like the ribs of a wheel, each rib vibrating with micropulses, the whole structure hovering 20 meters above the array like some alien halo that had come to inspect its worshippers. The message on the screens updated again, "Confirm interface location," and I felt something cold run down my spine as I realized what it meant. The coordinate the signal had given earlier, the one that pointed to where I was standing, wasn't metaphor, wasn't symbolic, wasn't misinterpreted. It was literal. The interface location it wanted was me. Melissa stepped between me and the console instinctively, as though she could shield me from something made of pure electromagnetic intent. But the lights overhead dimmed again, and a faint vibration passed through the floor, like the building had exhausted, and the message changed, impedance mismatch, adjusting. The spoked ring of light outside shifted, its filaments rotating around the circumference with slow, deliberate grace, and each rotation sent a ripple through the distortion field around it, bending the air, bending the sky, bending something deeper. And when the next ripple hit the array, the receivers shrieked with feedback so violent Melissa stumbled against the desk, clutching her ears. I forced myself toward the console, fighting the instinct to run and hit the hardware override that should have physically disconnected the array from every external system. But the moment I touched it, a static discharge snapped from the metal into my hand, sharp enough to leave a welt, and the override flipped back on its own, refusing to disconnect. The spoked ring contracted slightly, tightening its radius, and then, for the first time since Atlas Prime flashed, I heard something that wasn't our equipment, wasn't static, wasn't the hum of electronics. It was a tone, but not a carrier tone, not a broadcast. It was a sound in the air, vibrating through the building like a tuning fork pressed to the foundation.
low and resonant, too perfect to be mechanical. And Melissa gasped, dropping to her knees as the tone modulated subtly, shifting in pressure rather than pitch. I knelt beside her, pulling her up, but then the screens all went black at once, and a new message appeared in letters so large they filled the entire room with their reflected glow. You are not the node. The word stabbed something primitive in me, because the message wasn't scolding, it was disappointed. The spoked ring outside brightened, its filaments pulsing faster now, and I felt a pressure behind my eyes, a sense like someone rifling through the drawers of my mind, not violently, not invasively in a brutal way, but searching, scanning, as though trying to match me to something I didn't possess. Melissa whispered, "Dan, what is it looking for?"
But I couldn't answer because I didn't know. And the worst part was that the thing seemed to know that I didn't know, and the disappointment deepened. The message changed. Node not present. Connection unresolved. Initiating broad search, and my stomach flipped because a broad search in human terms meant sweeping a database, but a broad search in whatever Atlas Prime was meant scanning the environment itself. Outside, the spoked ring expanded rapidly, quadrupling in diameter in a second, then stopping abruptly, as though it had reached its maximum size. And the filaments shifted orientation, pointing outward now instead of inward, and a wave of pressure hit the array. Silent, invisible, but violent enough to rattle the racks and topple an unused chair. The receivers came online without command, cycling wildly through frequencies as the ring emitted pulses that weren't directed at us, but through us, pulses that spread outward across the desert like sonar. One of the side monitors lit with a map overlay, and for a horrifying moment, I watched as the pulses propagated across the southwest in expanding concentric circles, rippling across terrain, bouncing off ionospheric layers, reflecting from structures, each returning echo feeding into the processing chain the signal had created. It was scanning the continent. The thought lodged in my throat like a stone. Whatever Atlas Prime was searching for, it believed it was somewhere on Earth. The main display updated with a new line, target unknown, confidence decreasing. And for one breath I thought, irrationally, foolishly, that maybe it would give up, maybe it would retract, maybe it would leave. But then a deeper fear rose, cold and clinical. What if its protocol dictated escalation if its initial phase failed? What if searching was only phase 1? The spoked ring brightened again, brighter than before, and the tone vibrating through the building dropped in frequency so low it felt like gravity itself had changed, like the world had gained weight. Melissa clutched the edge of the desk, wheezing, and I grabbed her shoulders, dragging her away from the consoles in case an electrical discharge hit again. But before we could move more than a step, the entire array shut down in one massive, synchronized blackout. Lights, consoles, cooling systems, every piece of hardware dying in perfect unison, leaving us in pure darkness. For 3 seconds there was nothing. No hum, no tone, just the distant pulse of blood in my ears. And then the emergency lights flickered on, weak and red and sickly, and the main display powered itself using a reserve battery that shouldn't have been enough to run even its backlight. One line of text appeared. Last query, resolve or default. I whispered, default to what? And the room answered, not with words, but with the sudden roar of every receiver coming back online in a deep-tuned frenzy, a blizzard of static flooding the room with white noise that swelled until it rattled my teeth, and the spoked ring outside released a pulse of light so bright that the camera feed whited out instantly. The static crescendoed into a scream of signal, and then cut off, abrupt, absolute. The message on the display faded, replaced by a single new word. Choose.
The word choose pulsed on the screen in that dim red emergency glow like a heartbeat demanding an answer.
And for the first time since the night began, I felt something dangerously close to anger rise in me. Not fear, not awe, not helplessness, but pure human refusal to be turned into a pawn by something that didn't even breathe. And I slammed both palms on the console and shouted into the thick, humming air, "Choose what?" But the room swallowed my voice, deadening it, flattening it, as if the building itself didn't want the question heard. Melissa pulled at my sleeve, her voice shaking. "Dan, please, don't provoke it." But some part of me had crossed a line, some instinct older than logic, whispering that if we didn't assert ourselves now, we would never get another chance. And then the screens flickered, and the word choose dissolved into a flood of cascading symbols, spirals of characters and waveforms twisting into each other in an impossible dance. And I realized with a sinking feeling that the signal wasn't asking me to choose anything yet. It was showing me the menu of choices, the phase states, the pathways, a branching topology of consequences so vast and so alien that my mind skidded on it like ice, unable to grip. The spoked ring outside contracted sharply, the filaments drawing inward like the diaphragm of a mechanical iris, and then it fired downward, not in a beam of light, not in heat, not in anything our senses were built to interpret, but in a pressure wave that made my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. And every console in the room lit with a different pattern, each one pulsing in a unique rhythm, each one forming a different answer. And that was the moment I understood the awful truth. Whatever Atlas Prime had been searching for on Earth, whatever node it wanted to interface with, it believed I could stand in for it, that a human could substitute for whatever it expected if only we could provide the correct response, the correct alignment, the correct pattern. And the weight of that responsibility hit me so hard my knees buckled. Melissa caught me before I collapsed, whispering, "You don't have to do this." But when I looked at her, I saw something that terrified me more than the signal. She wasn't pleading for me to run, she was pleading for me to choose correctly, as though even she had begun to accept that this nightmare was now my burden. The emergency lights flickered, and the ring outside pulsed again, harder this time, and the message reappeared, "Default in 40 seconds." And the countdown began ticking silently in the corner of the screen, each number vanishing like a breath in cold air. Default, I realized, with a clarity that felt like a blade, meant whatever Atlas Prime would do if no node answered, whatever protocol it executed when no compatible intelligence responded. And I didn't know if that default was passive observation or withdrawal, or something catastrophic, but the pulse of the ring made my bones vibrate as if warning me that default was not something Earth wanted. Melissa scrambled to one of the secondary consoles, fingers flying across the dead keyboard as if muscle memory alone could force life back into it, but the system stayed cold, inert, waiting for something else, something only the signal could validate. The countdown hit 30 seconds, and my heartbeat synced with it unwillingly, each thud matching the silent tick as if Atlas Prime were reaching through that ring of light and nudging my autonomic nerves like piano strings. I forced my gaze across the consoles, searching the patterns on each one, trying to find anything familiar, any structure that resembled the handshake pulses, the impedance sweeps, the harmonic ladders we saw earlier. And then one display caught my eye, not because it was bright, but because it was dimmer than the rest, almost static, a barely moving waveform that looked out of place among the complex cascades around it. I moved toward it, ignoring the dizziness rising in my head, and as I approached, the waveform sharpened, as if sensing my attention, And then something impossible happened. It shifted into a pattern I recognized, not from astronomy, not from any experiment, but from my own life. It was my voice print. Years ago, during calibration tests, the array recorded samples of the staff speaking simple words to test acoustic leakage filters. And one of those tests, my check 1, had been fed through a modulation scrambler I'd designed as a joke for a colleague. The scrambled signature had become a private shorthand in my research notes, a symbol I never used outside my own work, a pattern no one on Earth would ever think to encode, and now it was on the screen, waiting, repeating slowly, like a memory tapped awake. Melissa saw it too, her eyes widening, and she whispered, "Dan, it isn't looking for a node, it's looking for you." And in that instant, the countdown hit 20 seconds, and the ring outside pulsed again with a shiver that rattled the dust from the ceiling beams. I reached toward the console, my hand trembling violently, and the system reacted before I touched it, stabilizing the pattern, syncing to my pulse, aligning itself the way two clocks align for digital handshake, and the message changed. Confirm identity. I swallowed hard, my throat raw and metallic from the pressure in the room, and I didn't know what the confirmation would trigger, what acknowledging myself to something that crossed interstellar space would mean, but the countdown slammed past 15 seconds, and fear gave way to a terrible clarity. Default was worse. Default was what happened when civilizations failed to answer. I braced myself against the desk, leaned close to the mic port, even though the system was offline, and whispered the same words I whispered into that scrambler years ago. Check 1. And the moment the words left my mouth, every console lit with blinding white, and the ring outside constricted violently, collapsing inward toward its center like a star imploding into equilibrium. The pressure wave shifted into a piercing resonance that made Melissa scream, and I pulled her into my arms, shielding her as the building trembled like a ship in a storm, and for a moment I thought the entire array would rip off its foundations. But then, silence. Not the earlier listening silence, but a vacuum silence, a cosmic inhalation, and then a new message appeared in soft, steady letters. Identity accepted, initializing transfer. I barely had time to breathe before a beam of something, not light, not sound, not anything registered by human senses, pierced through the control room wall without disturbing a single molecule of dust, touching my chest like a fingertip, and every nerve in my body convulsed. It wasn't pain, not exactly. It was knowing. A sudden flood of awareness not my own, a presence vast and distant, not malicious but unbearably old, brushing against my mind like a glacier against skin, and images spilled into my thoughts, stars collapsing, planets forming, structures the size of continents drifting through nebulae, nodes like seeds scattered across worlds, waiting, always waiting. And then a final emotion that wasn't human, but felt like grief. We were late because we were not the first. I collapsed to my knees, gasping, tears streaming down my face, without understanding why, and the beam retracted, the ring outside dimming, its filaments extinguishing one by one, until a faint afterglow remained, and the final message formed gently on the screen like a farewell. Node initiated. Watch, wait, learn. And then every console died, every emergency light went black, and in the silence that followed, I felt something inside me, some echo of that impossible touch, still humming faintly behind my heartbeat, as if Atlas Prime had left a thread inside my mind, a connection that would never fully break. Melissa knelt beside me, trembling, whispering my name over and over, but I couldn't answer because I could still feel the echo, still hear the last unspoken message behind the words. This wasn't contact, it was recruitment. And somewhere far above the earth, where the last traces of the spoked ring faded into the night, something waited for me to speak again.